Hey everyone, this is Sina with another episode of Into the Bytecode. My guest today is Michael Bentley, the co-founder and CEO of Euler Finance. So this was a wide-ranging kind of philosophical conversation about the history of DeFi, about the larger role that credit plays in the economy and the world, about how interest rates work and how we could design mechanisms to guide them in the right directions. And towards the end of the conversation, we also talked about Michael's PhD thesis before he got into crypto many years ago about building a mathematical model for natural selection and evolution, which I thought was really interesting and which has some parallels to how participants engage with each other in crypto protocols. I've gotten to know Michael better over the last few months and have a lot of respect for him, so it was fun to do this together. And I do want to say that nothing in this show is financial advice and that the host and guests may hold positions in the projects discussed. And with that, I hope you enjoy. That was a wild period of time. Like even thinking back to Yearn, and they distributed basically all the tokens to the user base, right? That's how it started. And it was this almost like mystical moment in time of like, why would someone do this? And it just feels like we're peering into the cypherpunk future where all of these utilities are running on the internet. Very cool.
Yeah, it was just, there was just so much innovation, so much crazy experimentation. It felt like really liberating during that time. And everybody was stuck in home, like in the UK especially, like everyone was just at home. And then you go on your computer and there's just like, there was so much urgency to get stuff done and to completely rebuild and challenge every idea you ever had about the way that the world works, in terms of finance. Weirdly, my origin story maybe even goes back quite a lot further backwards, because when I left university for my undergraduate, I wanted to save some money to go traveling and sort of have some fun. So I was like, I don't want to get a serious job here. I probably want to go into academia. I can't do that for a year and save money. Like it just doesn't really work in academia. And you have to go on and either study or do something meaningful. So I was like, what's the highest paying job I can get that'll give me some money to save for this trip? And it turns out, like, I started fishing around, and there was jobs at the Royal Bank of Scotland to go in as like a junior analyst. So my first taste of understanding finance and like what traditional institutions were like was I joined the Royal Bank of Scotland in August 2008, which was quite an important period in time. And my first sort of experience of that was sort of going into the office in the first few weeks, and there were just the Royal Bank of Scotland really treated they sort of speculated wildly on growth, and they were buying up other smaller banks. Loads of them had bad debt or like really risky loans and everything. And they'd actually been, I think there was something like they'd been essentially trying to raise money, and they realized one way to raise it was essentially to get their own employees to like reinvest some of their income.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and then it all came tumbling down. So just people in the office, just in tears. They'd lost their investments. They were losing their jobs. They were just the share price was crashing, and so I had that first taste of, well, this kid seems kind of like an awful place, like traditional finance. And over that year, I ended up learning tons and tons, because as a junior person, you're really cheap. So they didn't want to fire me, they wanted to fire all the expensive people. And so I ended up given loads of responsibilities to do things that I probably would never have had if I joined like a year before or something. So it was an interesting year, and I just saw how inefficient and clunky it was, and how backwards, and it was just so stagnant there. There was nothing interesting or innovative. There's so much intermediation and process and everything. It was just so unnecessary. And so
that's one of the periods of time that I kind of look back on and have FOMO that I wasn't part of the pain as much. Like I was a bit too young at that moment in time, but I've talked with other people. Like I think Hart, who's building UMA and Across, has told me the story of how he was working at Goldman Sachs in 2008 and like was just in the room when the entire thing is coming undone. And it feels like one of those things that just implants itself in your mind, and you just kind of like always can look back on it as a motivating example of like why we're working on this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there were just so many awful stories around that time. I never planned to sort of work in finance. Honestly, I always had my heart set on this sort of ivory tower academic sort of role that I'd sort of fantasized about from a sort of fairly young age, and that really reinforced it for me that I really didn't want to do that. Yeah, after
Why? Because there's like stuff to do in the world.
yeah, I think it seemed like there's just so much more to explore. There's so much, as an academic, you kind of problem solving and like, it's like a new frontier, right? And I guess there's two ways to do that. One is to go launch a startup and do something really innovative and exciting, but that wasn't really on my horizon, honestly. I sort of was a scientist at heart, I think, and that's why the academic route appealed to me. I wasn't really sure what the cool new tech was that I wanted to sort of to get involved in. So I think if you want to problem solve and solve like just really get into the heart of these kind of challenges, like just going into finance often doesn't do it. I got offered a lot of jobs when I finished my PhD to go work for firms in London on big salaries and things, and they want you to go in and do all these tests and hard problem solving challenges in the interviews, but then what I've heard from people is when you actually go and get in the room and do the job, you're just working in Excel and pulling up. It's all very sort of basic stuff, and all the challenge and the fun of it sort of like goes out of the window the day you join, really. In a lot of these roles, I'm sure it's not true of all of them, but I think in a lot of them, it's not really a challenge.
So I feel like one of the muscles that being an academic and doing a PhD and a postdoc kind of trains is the ability to pick interesting problems to work on, problems where you feel like there's something there potentially that it would be impactful if you actually made some progress on it. And that it is something that you could get traction on potentially, because you could also spend all this time in the wild and not get anywhere. So as you kind of started to kind of entertain this idea of working in crypto, in DeFi, like what do you remember how you thought about this problem space and why there's like a there, like why this is out of all the, the possible things to focus on, this is like the thing to go spend your time on?
Yeah, I do remember. It's part of the reason why we won this hackathon was I became intrigued with this idea, like how do you set an interest rate? Normally in a bank, you've got a team of analysts or whatever, they figure out what the interest rate should be. Or if you've got a central bank, you have like a team of central bankers, deciding this for everybody based on some criteria. And like the question that interested me in the early days of DeFi was how do you let interest rates emerge spontaneously? How do you set them if there's no central controller running the show? And I think I saw a really elegant and simple solution to this problem on Compound, but which I thought could be sort of taken even further and improved. On Compound, they essentially, said they had these people depositing into these pools, these lenders, and the interest rate rises as a function, just a simple function of how much is being borrowed from the pool. Like no one needs to set the interest rate, really. It just emerges spontaneously from the dynamics of the system. So that's kind of cool. But when you get a bit deeper into it, you realize, but hold on a second, because who chooses the line? Like who chooses how fast the interest rate rises as a function of how much borrowing there is, right? That's still a choice, and someone needs to set that. And if you make that line too steep, that function too steep, then the cost of borrowing will just rise too quickly for anybody in the market, and so no one will even use the pool. And if you set it too shallow, then the pool will become fully utilized. People just borrow, and they might never repay because they're borrowing so cheaply. It's like how do you solve this how do you make it more dynamic so you don't have to have someone choosing the shape of the curve as actively and kind of actively managing that? On Compound, the shape of those curves is all chosen by a decentralized governance system. There's also something that I thought was really cool, was that how could you, if you wanted to just take take even that out of the system, how could you do it? And there's a sort of branch of maths called control theory that I'd never really worked on personally, but
PID systems.
Yeah, PID systems like that some of my friends had worked on before. And I thought, why don't we just apply that to the pools? We'll try and target, put a PID controller on there that will target a sort of sane level of utilization in the pool, and then you can effectively just leave it, and the curve itself is in some sense like choosing itself right over time. Whenever you're above utilization, the interest rate would just rise, trying to prohibit further borrowing and attract more lenders. Whenever you're below target, the interest rate would keep falling, trying to attract more borrowers or just bring down utilization generally. So it's very similar bunch of maths, exactly the same bunch of maths to what you saw with like Elon's rocket recently. You know, the rocket that like comes down and just like falls and like slowly drifts into its sort of big metal chamber thing. Like it's a very cool bunch of maths in my opinion. It's the same stuff that like helps you set the temperature in your home to a nice constant rate, even as the weather conditions are variable outside. So I thought it'd be fun to apply that to lending. Basically.
It's been a long time since I've looked at the maths of PID controllers. Like I think I was pretty deep into it during my undergrad, but the high level intuition for it is that what are you exactly doing? You're taking the current value of, the variable you care about, you're comparing its current value, its rate of change, some things like that versus like the set points that you're trying to get to, and using that to orient things. There's like a feedback loop basically.
Exactly. Yeah. There's a target where you want to be. So in our case, we want the utilization of the pool to be, let's say 90% or 80%, something safe. And then each iteration, we measure our distance from the target. If we're really, really below the target, then we need to do something. The system needs to adjust itself to try to guide itself towards the target, right? And so you have different sort of knobs that you can turn to try to change the system. And in this case, it's the interest rate. You change the interest rate, you will increase or stimulate demand for borrowing from the pool, and the demand for supplying and withdrawing from the pool. And so you want to try to change that and toggle it until you drive the utilization back to where you think it should be. And in principle, if you have a great system, you can do that without having to come in and actively govern the system anymore. If it's being set up effectively. And there's lots of there's very simple ways to do it. Is just measure the distance from the target, and that's it. You only use that as the variable, but you can also measure how fast are you approaching the target. Like are you really, really quickly approaching your target now? Are you moving in the right direction at all? Or are you moving away? Here's the rate of change and going in the right direction. So then you can sort of like measure on average over time, like do I tend to be on the target or not? So you can start to make these models more and more complex. And obviously the control theory behind the rocket was probably incredibly dense mathematics and system behind that. It's very simple, and it turns out to make a controller for interest rates, at least one that works sort of
right. But the rocket is a kind of like deterministic physical system, whereas the interest rates are relying on irrational human beings to act out these principles.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. But I guess the one nice thing about finance is that people are only irrational for so long. The people are profit driven and motivated. So there's on short time scales, people are irrational, but I think over the longer time scales, you tend to find that the market is relatively rational and relatively efficient. If there's money to be made somewhere, people will change their behavior to try to make it most of the time. So there's a little bit of game theory there. But you're right. It's if the game theory is wrong, if that element of things is wrong, then these systems don't really look after themselves. One key assumption behind control theory and these exchange rates is that somebody will change their behavior to join or leave the pool, so that you have effectively interest rate arbitrage. If someone's earning a high interest rate over there, it's the higher interest rates higher over there. You want them to maybe leave and go join if your utilization's too high or whatever. So yeah, if people don't do that, if they are just completely irrational, then the system breaks down a little bit. And in practice, the only way you can find out whether it's working or not is to just kind of put it out there and see. And the fun thing about DeFi back in 2020 was that was totally acceptable. You know, it was a very experimental period where you could build anything and just see. You know, make an algorithmic stablecoin, make a lending platform, make a DEX. Like all of these things were kind of unknowns, and a lot of old economic theory that had probably been written down by folks in academia and never really given the chance to sort of be tested in the wild was just being tested, you know, on a weekly basis in DeFi during that time.
Yeah. So when you kind of think about the mechanism for setting an interest rate, and there's this prior work of, you know, all this theory around how you could design the PID system and like how people should react to it. You know, there's this saying of no idea survives its first collision with reality, you know, and you kind of see how things work really in practice. So, I mean, having both been kind of living in DeFi yourself, but also having built a protocol that's been used for a long time, how does this stuff work in reality? Like what, how do people actually behave? Maybe another way of framing it is like, it kind of like maybe connects to the efficient market hypothesis too. Like, how do you think about that as someone who's been deep in the weeds with it?
Yeah, I think, like I say, over long time scales, I think it's the efficient market hypothesis. You can kind of trust it and believe in it and build under that sort of principle. That people will behave rationally. On short time scales and in DeFi, that's not always the case. I don't think DeFi is known for having the most rational user base at times. There's a lot of exuberance shown at times, and a lot of depression at other times that seems a little irrational. You know, I just look back, you know, back 2020, it was like, you know, DeFi is going to basically replace traditional finance within 2 years. And then you go 2 years later and everyone was telling you that DeFi is completely dead, completely pointless, makes no sense anymore. And we're all losers for working here. And now where are we back to again? Well, now we're probably back to a little bit closer to where we were in 2020, where it's like, yeah, no, DeFi is going to replace traditional banking, and you know, everyone's going to be using DeFi in the future. So yeah, there's those like boom and bust sort of
right. There's no way that all of these statements can be true in such close proximity to each other.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, it's such short time frames to bounce around different ideas. You know, these very different views of the future. But yeah, you asked how, you know, how do the idea, you know, when these ideas meet reality, do they sort of play out? I think that it's the case that with these interest rate models, things are just a little bit more complex than you imagine, and that maybe some ideas can be brought to market too soon, which I think everyone's aware about, but it's especially true here. For the controllers to work, you need interest rate arbitrage, but if there's not enough people trading and there's not enough liquidity and there's not enough if it's not easy to know what the interest rate should be for people, then they can't arbitrage it. And there are all sorts of other inefficiencies and costs in the system to actually carrying out interest rate arbitrage. If I tell you that the interest rate for USDC on platform A is 5% and platform B is 7%, should that be arbitraged or not? Well, there's not enough information to answer that question, right? Like, what other risks are there in the system? You should always be trying to arbitrage your risk-adjusted yield, not just the yield itself. And that it turns out is a very, very hard thing to measure. It's a very, very tough thing to say whether or not 7% is better than 5% if you don't know all the rest of the context around the system. You know, is it a new platform? This is an old platform that's battle tested. What kind of exposure does the higher interest rate have to different collateral types? What kind of user base does it have? What types of parameters are in the system in terms of how much leverage people can do, what their borrowing power is, all these minor details about where that 7% comes from factor into whether or not it's a fair rate of return or not. It might be that 7% and 5% are actually equal when you do the risk adjustment. But yeah, you need to have sophisticated actors or either sophisticated actors or a really large market where these things can figure themselves out. The efficient market hypothesis assumes a large marketplace, right? And if you don't have that, then these assumptions sort of break a little bit. And I think that's definitely true of lots of things in DeFi today. Is it's still a little bit too small for some of these ideas that sound great in practice to actually be, hold true and when they get brought to market.
Yeah. How should one think about risk? So when I personally, as like an individual investor who's not necessarily that sophisticated, doesn't have the resources to do all of this analysis, I look at the interest rates that are available. I kind of, the naive way of thinking about it is like higher, better, and I'm just going to get more return. But if we kind of like put ourselves into the shoes of the sophisticated actor, and you're looking at all of these variables that you're talking about, like how does one construct their risk model? Like, how do you actually think about this?
I mean, there are lots of ways to try to do it, I think, but it's almost impossible to do it perfectly. So everybody's using heuristics or approximations and trying to kind of guesstimate this stuff. There are simple things to look out for, that I think anybody can do, which is look at, if I'm lending, who am I lending to? What are the terms of this loan, right? Am I lending with a loan to value? Like how over collateralized are the people that are borrowing from me? Like how likely is it that they're going to repay? And that depends on the collateral types that they're using, how over collateralized they are. And you might say, is everything over collateralized? DeFi is focused on over collateralized lending, but in practice, yes, everything is over collateralized. Whether or not you're taking a loan out in traditional finance, where it doesn't feel like you're putting down any collateral, you almost always are in the form of something that, and it might be something intangible. It might be like your future income that you're pledging, or
your
future
credit score,
freedoms, your credit score. You always pledge something as collateral. And the reason that you repay, and the reason most people repay, is that the thing that they pledge is almost always worth more than the value of the loan itself, right? This is why credit works in the world. It's that you always want to repay typically because you're scared about not repaying. You'll lose something if you don't repay. So yeah, that's the simplest thing, is like, just look at the system and go, do I think the people are like, under what conditions are these people going to repay? Under what conditions might they walk away? If I'm lending against people who are collateralizing Bitcoin, if Bitcoin, rises in value very quickly, what are they likely to repay? They're going to have more collateral to be able to back the loan, so everything's going to be fine. If Bitcoin drops very, very quickly overnight, maybe the collateral will actually be worth less than what I've lent the person, and so they'll just walk away. So the quality of the collateral, the parameters around how over collateralized people are really, really important. There are other really nuanced factors about, like, is the collateral itself like there? Is it going to be there? Is somebody going to be able to essentially use it to repay the loan in the event that the loan becomes distressed? Like in the real world, you have a house that's collateralizing a mortgage. Is that house always going to be worth enough? Like, if someone wants to come and liquidate the position that you've got with your mortgage and repay the loan, how easy is it going to be for them to liquidate it and to force repay the loan? It's just so complex. There's so much depth to this topic. It's really hard for people. And I think the real answer is that, as to how you should manage risk, that most people probably aren't qualified and shouldn't be directly interacting with the lower level elements of lending and borrowing. I mean, I don't mean that from a sort of like regulatory standpoint. I think people should have the freedom to choose what they want to do. But I feel like from a just my advice
Just
to
like a
anybody wanting to,
timeshare attention,
yeah,
ability to actually do the analysis. Like most of us aren't equipped to do this from first principles.
that's right. So the best thing to do is to pay somebody a small fee, or and figure out somebody that you trust ultimately to manage risk on your behalf, and to look into all these details for you. That's how the world works ultimately. We do this with almost everything in our daily lives, right? We don't try to become an expert in every single element of daily life, and like managing risk is something that you need to be an expert in if you want to do it well. So I think in a lot of cases, it just makes sense to outsource it, outsource that job to somebody who's an expert.
Yeah. Also thinking about if I was the kind of risk manager and kind of looking at profiling the risk of a certain collateral, it feels like crypto is the kind of place where, taking a purely quantitative approach to, looking at the volatility of this over time would potentially miss the forest for the trees, because these things have such short history, and they might benefit from more fundamental analysis of like what is the actual mechanism here, like what is this collateral, like how is it going to behave. And you can't necessarily just do a quantitative modeling exercise based on the past.
Yeah, that's right. You always have to consider the fundamentals as well, and that itself takes a lot of time and effort and research. I think Warren Buffett always said this about these models for pricing options. They're just kind of like these dumb machines that like you push in the data from the past, and then they spit out a number for you. But like the reason why he's made so much money in investments is that they're focusing on the fundamentals, and fundamentals matter in some sense. The history is it's part of the equation, right? It does matter to a degree, and it kind of gives you like sane bounds or approximate like values that way you should be looking for risk. But like the fundamentals here and now, what actually shape the future. So it's all part of the equation. There's no purely quantitative way to do this, in my opinion. You can't just set a bot running and let it figure this out. There are lots of off-chain factors that and qualitative elements to things that make a huge difference. And even the quantitative stuff, like you say, is like you have very short histories here. You don't have decades and decades, and every moment in time is different to the last. We like to, as humans, pattern match and go, yeah, this is like we're in a high interest rate environment now. That's similar to the 70s. It's like, well, the 70s, I hear about like parents and people say this, like, no, like the world is not at all like it was in the 70s. The only thing you're pattern matching here is that there was a time when interest rates didn't used to be zero. They used to be like 5 or 6% like they are now. But that doesn't mean that the way the world works at all is similar. There was much less globalization back then and all the rest of it. So just looking at data and trying to pattern match on certain measurements on data sets is a recipe for disaster as well.
Into the Bytecode is sponsored by Splits. Are you tired of sacrificing security for usability? Splits believes it's still way too hard for teams to self-custody their on-chain assets. They're building a new kind of internet-native bank on top of Ethereum. Splits makes it easy for teams to manage the whole lifecycle of their finances, from structuring revenue-sharing agreements, using payment flows like splits and waterfalls, to managing those earnings once you receive them, using passkeys and smart accounts. Splits is being used by teams like Protocol Guild, Zora, Songcamp, and others. I'm a big believer in them and recommend checking them out. You can learn more at splits.org. Yeah.
It's just so complex. There's so much
to maybe ask a ridiculously big question.
Yeah.
Like how does the world work right now? Like if we think about the macro picture of both, the global economy, globalization, all this sort of like bigger picture stuff, but also kind of like incorporate in where we are in crypto and DeFi. Like what sort of a regime are we living in? What are the forces? Like what are the main dynamics shaping what's happening right now?
That's a really big question. I mean, I'll tell you one thing that I find interesting right now that I think is kind of a little bit scary, is like demographics, the way that a lot of wealthy nations are sort of shaping up in terms of demographics. We have, in the UK, we have an aging population. It's people are living longer, and in some cases, we're approaching a point where people are kind of living as long in retirement as they are during their working sort of age, from the age of like 20 through to 60. A lot of people are living 60 to 100 now, 60 well into their 90s. I don't know how we're going to pay for that. As the old models where we used to pay in during your working lifespan, and then you get people in the future paying for you through retirement. I just don't know if that's going to work as well as it once did. And I think it's kind of an interesting but sort of scary time on the horizon. And I also feel a little bit like the people who are in charge of big finance and central banks and politicians don't really have a good sense in how we fix the problems we have, like the debt, the amount of debt in the system, and our inability to repay it. It really does feel a bit scary, like something's a little bit broken and no one really knows how to fix it. That's my sort of pessimistic view on the macro sort of climate of the world. A lot of debt, no real way to pay it down other than maybe by printing a load of money. But it feels like finances is saying there's no free lunch. And it feels like maybe, from my perspective, that we've been assuming there's been this free lunch for the last few decades, and now they're like slowly but surely the chickens are going to come home to roost, and we're going to realize no, there wasn't a free lunch. There never is, and we need to revise how we do things.
Yeah, but I feel like the idea of debt is somewhat fundamental to the idea of, I don't know, like our larger economic capitalist system and progress over time, where you're kind of borrowing from your future self and assuming that you're going to grow into it at a faster rate than you have to pay back the interest. This is maybe also a question that I wanted to ask you as someone who's been working on borrowing and lending. Like, what is there a fundamental importance to borrowing and lending, to credit? Like, how does it fit into the bigger picture of like finance and the world?
It's the only thing that matters in a way. Like it's the way that we have a more efficient system, right? We go back to just a simple society where everyone has slightly different skill sets. You can try and do everything yourself, but the most efficient way to do things is to divide labor among specialists. But then those specialists needs a way to exchange the product of their labor with one another, and so they can either do that directly with the assets that they produce, or the thing that they produce, but that's incredibly inefficient because you don't necessarily need everything all at the same time, right? So you have to delay payment, and when you delay payment, how do you do that? Well, you need some kind of unit of account, some way to exchange value over time horizons, and the best way to do that is to kind of abstract these payments into a currency or some kind of monetary unit, and then to have that passed around. And I think money itself is a form of debt, right? It's just a delayed payment for something, a way to exchange value over time.
Interesting.
Yeah, to convert. Whenever you have all these different assets in the world, they all need exchanging. The best thing to do, rather than to exchange, cows for furniture, is to like go into money first, like route it through money, and then that's so that there's one unit of account everyone exchanges into. And I guess that's the big that's the big goal for Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies potentially, is that they become that unit of account for which we use for exchanging goods and services and debt and credit over time.
Interesting. So the unit of account itself we can think of as a form of debt.
I think so, yeah. It's like a note. It's like a promise to pay you back in the future, right? If I give rather than giving you giving you some goods or services now. I give you a note saying, I promise to give you these goods and services in the future, effectively. And that's ultimately what money is. But yeah, for any person trying to make their way in the world needs to, you rely fundamentally on a division of labor in society to get the goods and services that you need. And for that, debt is incredibly important. You get the chance to borrow now to pay for things that you need to be a more productive person, right? So if you have, when credit markets break, innovation slows down, productivity slows down, just people struggle to trade with one another anymore, and the whole system sort of breaks, and is no longer efficient.
Yeah. So kind of like thinking through it in that lens, like the project of DeFi, and I mean Euler specifically, is to build these global credit markets in a way that have that kind of allow their counterparts to come together in a much more kind of fluid, market-driven way, and where the interest rates are set by self-adjusting mechanisms rather than by individual human beings that are analyzing the underlying things.
Yes, although I'd say it's
although you're kind of like bringing those two elements together in the design in a certain way too.
Yeah, I would say the big goal of Euler is really to provide an efficient infrastructure that can form the basis of any type of credit market, whatever type of collateral people want to use. It's the kind of the infrastructure that brings these credit markets to market for people to use on both sides, whether or not they want to do uncollateralized lending or collateralized lending, whether or not it's permissionless or permissioned. What we wanted to do when we built Euler was really take the real fundamentals of what it means to lend or borrow something, take that that fundamental promise of the borrower is always going to be over collateralized, abstract that into essentially a computational module, abstract all those principles, the small principles, into different modules, and then let people compose those modules together into in like Lego pieces in different ways to build different types of credit-based products and infrastructures. So with Euler, you're not forced to use the interest rate model mechanism I described earlier. You can build credit markets with those kind of reactive control theory based interest rates, but you can also use much simpler interest rate models. You could create fixed rate lending markets. You can create you can use collateral that's crypto native volatile assets like Bitcoin and ETH. You can use real world assets like tokenized yield strategies, tokenized T-bills, that kind of thing as collateral. You could even do completely like what people call uncollateralized lending, right? Where you're making a promise using something intangible as less fungible as collateral. So that's where we ended up when we rebuilt Euler v2, is we wanted to just abstract all these kind of like bigger ideas about how lending and credit works into modules, and let people rebuild those modules into products of all sorts of different flavors and varieties.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's the degree of the expressiveness of the design is very cool. How do you think about this question of, I guess one question that's maybe in the background as you describe that is this question of designing a modular versus a more, monolithic, or the positive cut at that is like a more integrated system, right? And I feel like I personally, philosophically, always kind of gravitate towards the more open, composable, modular systems. But then also when I look at the world, like when we look at phones, let's say, right, of like Android versus iPhone. I use an iPhone because it's like you can actually do some amazing things when the entire stack is like under one roof and you can integrate everything together. Um, how do you think about that in the context of lending markets and Euler?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a long-standing debate, right? I think it was this big debate about, Windows, PC versus Mac, and Apple's approach versus versus Microsoft. Both of those companies, I think, build from modular principles. They both build modular, from those modular primitives, I think, underlying everything. But they brought them to market in quite a different way. I think I always describe Apple's approach as this like cohesive modularity, where they then took the modules and built really opinionated products on top of those with those modules, with their systems. Whereas in some ways the Microsoft approach was just like let anybody kind of come in and build on the system. And there's benefits to both. It's hard to say, over time, it's kind of swung one way or another, in terms of who's winning. Microsoft is this absolute beast, right? And if people are building other products on them, you just get so much more, so many more options on a Microsoft system, and that's why they're spread through every household, right? When I was a kid, you just be like, you wanted a printer, like every printer under the sun, you could
Right.
all these options that all said they worked on Microsoft, but it wasn't very cohesive. I wouldn't say. It was a bit of a mess, right? These systems in principle worked well with one another, but there was a lot of optionality there, but they didn't always work. And then on the other side, you had Apple, and Apple was just like, no, you're going to have it like this way. You can have one word processing unit, and we think it should work like this. And if you don't like it, then that's tough. So very, very opinionated product spec. And I think there's a need for both approaches in the world. They kind of come with trade-offs, right? Everybody loves iPhones because it's a great product, fundamentally. But it's hard to say that Microsoft haven't been successful by having a more open system that allows lots of people to kind of move quickly and innovate and bring their own products to market. Some of the most successful software products that were landed on Microsoft systems long before Apple was ever able to kind of have their own version of it on theirs. And I think in the long run, Apple have kind of seeded ground a little bit and changed strategy a little bit there by allowing other people to eventually build on top of Apple.
And I feel like, I mean, it's somehow like the core promise of crypto too, of like we turn these things that were, singular, offered by a single service provider, we turn those into markets. And that market-driven approach allows the best designs to kind of like emerge and naturally like gain market share and win. And there's also, I mean, a certain way that with Euler's design specifically, like you've talked about this idea of global versus local paternalism, right? Which like global paternalism is like there's one solution. It has the right answer. In the case of lending, it's maybe a single, pool where the risk parameters are set by a DAO that's contracting an external risk manager or something like that. In the context of Euler, actually anyone can come in and create their own pools and be the kind of like local, the local benevolent dictator of that pool and set the interest rates. And then the user can kind of choose which of these to buy into ultimately. So you're kind of like getting the best of both worlds in a certain way.
Yeah, that's right. You the two extremes for me, if you have like lots of different assets that people want to borrow, you can make an opinionated product that combines those in a very sort of capital efficient system where they're all connected with one another, and if you want to do, if you want to be able to borrow many different assets, you don't necessarily want to fragment the liquidity everywhere into lots of different isolated units where, if I want to borrow USDC against Bitcoin, I have a separate market for that, and I'm able to borrow Bitcoin USDC using ETH, I have a separate market for that, and gold, and then there are hundreds, thousands of assets out there. Do I want a separate isolated market for borrowing USDC against all the possible collaterals in the world? Well, it doesn't really scale very well, but what it does do is it offers users a lot of flexibility, and it isolates risk very nicely, right? If the Bitcoin collateral goes bad, then the only person that loses money on the lending side, the USDC side, is in that particular market. So this fragmentation on the lower level,
right? Like if you lent money collateralized by a mixed bag of a secure thing like Bitcoin and a bunch of like random insecure things like meme coins, and those meme coins go down in value, and so the people who had borrowed with that collateral decide to just take the money and run, you kind of, as the lender, you have exposure to all of that, and so you end up losing. But there's this like fundamental trade-off that if you like fork these collaterals into different pools, then there's less capital efficiency, right? And like you're kind of like creating separate markets that exist in parallel to each other rather than being connected.
Yeah. So there's massive trade-offs with the two different approaches to managing risk. And I don't think there's one size fits all for every different type of user. So our philosophy was always let the market choose what it wants and let users choose what they want. For some people, I think it's perfectly acceptable to want to deposit USDC and lend to one collateral, and to be able to manage that risk and to kind of go in and choose that market. And for other subsets of users, it makes more sense to outsource the choice of what to lend to a specialist. And so there were two types of specialists. There's one that essentially sits on top of all these isolated pools, which is this like local paternalism, I suppose, which is like somebody, like one of the risk managers out there, like a Gauntlet or somebody that you essentially deposit into their vault, and then they have a more of an opinionated flow around once multiple deposits go into their like upper level vault, where does it flow to in these lower level sort of risk isolated pools? I describe that as a sort of local paternalistic mechanism. It's paternalistic because you're relying on this paternalist character or entity or risk manager to come in and decide where your funds get allocated, where they get lent out. And if one of these lower level vaults essentially gets exploited or something bad happens, there's bad debt generated through failure of the collateral pricing mechanism or something, ultimately the hope is that the person doing the paternalistic sort of risk management hasn't allocated 100% of your funds to this one lower level vault. So maybe you lose 5%, you take a 5% haircut, but you don't lose all your funds. The alternative approach is rather than having many different USDCs from which people can borrow against different assets, you just have one USDC market, and that one USDC market accepts multiple different collateral types. And moreover, the USDC itself can be used as collateral to borrow from those assets as well. So in that approach, you have a much more capital efficient system because you're effectively now rehypothecating collateral. When I deposit my USDC, I'm using it as collateral to borrow Bitcoin, but I'm also lending it to somebody else who wants to borrow my USDC. These more capital efficient systems where they're kind of cross-collateralized, they need a much greater degree of risk management, I would say. And I call this a more of a global paternalistic outlook for things, because the risk manager is effectively managing risk on multiple separate vaults, and if any one of those vaults suffers a default, that the risk can spread between the different assets. If the USDC collateral turns out not to be viable, then that means that whoever was accepting USDC as collateral, that vault is no longer viable, which means other vaults that it's being used as collateral for are no longer viable, and so you get this contagion effect. And in some sense, it's like we discussed earlier. There's no free lunch, right? There's no perfect solution for out there. Each person has their own risk reward tolerance, and there are different models for lending and borrowing. And the cool thing about Euler is that it allows builders to create isolated pools with the local paternalism on top, or it allows builders to create these more capital efficient, globally managed sort of systems. So there are, if we think about some of the Euler's competitors, you have Morpho, which is on one end of the spectrum, where it has lots of lower level risk isolated pools with locally paternalistic risk managers on top, and on the other end of the spectrum, you've got something like Aave, which is a big monolithic lending protocol with a team of risk managers essentially employed by a DAO on top, this globally paternalistic system. And I don't know. It's up to you to choose as a user, in my opinion, which model of lending and borrowing you prefer. Euler supports any model, and I think it depends on the assets. It depends on the state of the economy. It depends on all these different factors. It's really difficult to say in the long run. It's just important to let the market choose. The market will always get it right in the long run.
Mm-hmm. And do you get anything by allowing all of this to happen in one protocol?
Yes, in Euler, the primitive within Euler is a single vault that allows a user to deposit assets. Those assets can be used for two purposes. They can either be lent out, or they can be used as collateral for borrowing from another vault, or both. And whenever I deploy a new market on Euler, I can accept any existing collateral within the system, any existing vault within the system as collateral for my new credit protocol. And what this means is that the more people that build on the system, the bigger the network of possible collaterals gets. If I build a market for USDC that's well managed, maybe it doesn't even need to be managed, but it's well liked. It's proven itself over time to be a good market that doesn't lose people money. Then people will start to accept it as collateral in their credit markets because it's a reliable collateral. As they accept it as collateral in their credit markets, that's great for them. They've now got a ready-made pool of existing collateral and users willing to use that collateral for borrowing. And it's also great for the vault itself because it's now getting more deposits from people as they start to use it as collateral to borrow other new assets in the system. So there are very big network effects here by letting people build within the network. Even if you don't necessarily extract too much value directly from every new market that's being built, what you do is you grow the network and you grow the base of users within the most reliable collateral vaults within the system.
Mm-hmm.
Over time, things that are good collateral get used more and more as collateral, which grows their deposits, which makes them even more attractive for use in other people's credit markets as collateral.
So there's a kind of incentive in if you are a pool creator or like a builder of some kind to do this earlier on because your vault could become a kind of collateral of record in the system.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. We already starting to see that in the early phase now that people are reusing especially some of the blue chip crypto assets and stablecoin assets. Vaults for those assets tend to be popular and accepted as collateral in many different lending markets. That's not really possible on other protocols to do that. The way that where different markets talk to one another is usually fixed. It's usually defined as part of the sort of product layer on other protocols, whereas on Euler it's a fundamental component of the underlying infrastructure and architecture that allows any vault to talk to any other vault in the system, and then define the rules under which it's prepared to accept some other vault as collateral. It can set the pricing rules, the permissions, whether or not it's a permissioned system or permissionless. How is the collateral going to be priced? There's a lot of flexibility for builders there to determine how collateral gets accepted in the system for borrowing.
Yeah. So how's it going in practice? I think we're like 3 months into the new protocol being live, so it's very early. But there's this I think it's like explorer.euler.xyz, which kind of shows all the crazy interconnections between these vaults. Um, what is the topology of this network starting to look like? Like, are there any kind of like interesting, weird things you've noticed?
Nothing too surprising. For me, that I think it's relatively. I wasn't completely sure how it would start to look when we launched, but in retrospect, it's kind of obvious, I suppose. There are there are different types of things people want to borrow, and we start to see clusters forming around popular types of trades. So I can probably try to categorize it, I suppose. There's one trade is you want to borrow against your Bitcoin or against your ETH. That has a certain risk profile. It tends to generate a certain like type of interest rate that we've seen that we've seen emerge in the markets across crypto for several years. That's a pretty standard trade. There are now increasingly new forms of yield-bearing Bitcoin assets and yield-bearing Bitcoin, yield-bearing ETH. So another popular trade is to use those yield-bearing assets as collateral, borrow a non-yield-bearing equivalent, and effectively loop the trade. It's a so-called carry trade. You earn 5% interest on the yield-bearing thing. You pay 2% to borrow. So you will deposit the yield-bearing thing as collateral, borrow the non-yield-bearing thing, swap it into more yield-bearing asset, redeposit, and effectively loop. And in doing so, you can earn a multiplier on the difference between those two yields. So you might loop and turn rather than just earning a 5% interest rate, you might end up earning a 10 or 15% interest rate. Obviously, you're exposed to more risk in doing so, but the risk is somewhat controlled given that the two assets are representations of the same underlying unit, right? They're both some representation of ETH.
Right. So your collateral ratio will not necessarily change that much if the price goes down because the numerator and denominator are both moving together.
They should be most of the time. Now that's not always the case, and so there's clearly risk involved here. There's duration risk. A lot of the yield-bearing assets carry yield because, well, you're usually getting paid for taking some kind of risk, and there are different kind of risks being taken depending on what the asset is. But sometimes it's a duration risk. Sometimes it's a slashing risk if you're doing staking. So there are different risks that people get compensated for, and if those risks manifest in a large way, or there's some kind of black swan event, then the assumption that the two assets are going to be worth the same can obviously break, which can lead people to take haircuts and to take losses and get liquidated and so on when they're borrowing these assets and doing these loops. So it's definitely not risk free, but it's a very popular trade because the assumption is most of the time if you're managing the risk well that those black swan events are just incredibly rare. So a lot of the time people view it as an easier way to earn an increased rate of return on their assets. So that's a very popular trade. Those kind of carry trades on crypto native assets. There's similar things happening increasingly with real world assets where people are bringing on real world assets and collateralizing those. Often those real world assets are yield bearing. So they're doing a very similar trade with depositing a T-bill to borrow $1, non-yield bearing dollar stable coin and then looping those positions. There are people taking the opposite side of the long trade. So they're using dollars to borrow volatile crypto assets. They sometimes do this because they feel like they can hedge a position that they maybe hold elsewhere. There's a very popular trade at the moment, the Athena carry trade. Athena have a very nice system where they allow users to deposit ETH or staked ETH, and they will match that deposit with a short position on a perp exchange. Now, on perp exchanges, for structural reasons, they have this funding rate where you either pay to go long or short, and typically you pay to do the popular thing. So if everyone's going long, then you have to pay to go long. And who do you pay money to? Well, you pay to pay money to the people going short. And so sometimes you can earn a nice interest rate by being short. So what Athena and some other projects are doing is effectively matching these, like a long position in spot with a short position on the perp exchange. And if they get paid to hold the position on the short position on the perp exchange, then you get a nice rate of return on holding this sort of so-called delta neutral position. They've then tokenized this trade, and they've allowed people to effectively hold shares or tokens in this trade in the form of a dollar stable coin. And people are now using those types of assets as increasingly as collateral, and effectively using them as to carry out a carry trade, earning that rate of return on centralized exchanges, on perp exchanges, and using it to borrow non-yield bearing dollars. So also very popular. And so to bring it all back to what we're seeing in terms of like market structure on Euler, you can build all sorts of credit products. We're seeing people build sort of capital efficient clusters of markets around those popular trades. So there's a Bitcoin cluster somebody created where they're pairing non-yield bearing Bitcoin mapped assets on Ethereum with yield bearing versions of Bitcoin, for instance. There's an Euler Prime market, which the Euler DAO sanctioned, and that market is largely used for using volatile crypto assets to borrow dollars and often to go long, to build a leverage long position. So yeah, the popular trades attract builders to build, like try and customize and optimize as capital efficient but as risk managed as possible sort of groups of markets around those popular trades, which is obvious in hindsight, right? But it isn't always obvious what those trades will be and how they'll manifest. But yeah, increasingly we start to see some of the assets, some of the popular vaults that hold stable coins especially are being accepted as collateral in multiple different products. Which is great for those vaults because depositors, they bring more deposits to those vaults, which makes them even more attractive as collateral when people build new markets and new products. And then finally, I'd say the thing that Euler enables, which I think a lot of sort of infrastructure products in this sort of area don't, is way more customization around when it comes to oracles and permissioning and just the way the markets can be sort of configured with multiple collaterals and so on. And so we're starting to see use of Euler infrastructure to tokenize things, that positions and lending and borrowing positions that people used to create off-chain with just paper legal agreements. They're effectively creating similar types of arrangements on-chain, taking advantage of the enforcement, the strength of the enforced sort of conditions that the smart contracts provides relative to something that you get from a flimsy paper agreement. So they're doing things still partially off chain with a legal setup, but then just using the infrastructure Euler provides to create more transparency around the positions and make sure that the conditions under which the loan terms were specified in the paper agreements are actually enforced. Right? You can break a legal agreement, you can't break a smart contract agreement.
What's an example of people doing that specifically?
So they're tokenizing funds, essentially, taking a company's fund, putting a token wrapper around it, and using that as collateral to then borrow dollars against the fund.
Companies fund as in like their treasury, like what's sitting inside their checking account?
Like more of I'd say companies that is like investment funds that go out and
like investment funds.
Yeah, exactly. So they want to, it's kind of like what Athena's doing really. Like Athena as a whole is just a very specialized investment fund that focuses on that particular trade. But there are all sorts of different trades out there that people do that make good returns. And they hold a lot of assets and they hold a lot of value, but they often want to collateralize them so that they can go out and borrow, so that they can reinvest in themselves or reinvest in the system as a whole. And how do you do that borrowing? How do you borrow against a fund? Well, you need to be able to collateralize it, and then you need to find counterparties willing to lend to the fund, and then you need to specify the conditions under which the positions might be closed if the loan terms become distressed, right? So like maybe the fund's NAV loses value for some reason, or that just the loan terms expire or whatever. And with smart contracts, you can write down those conditions and say, no, under no conditions will this ever the rug won't be pulled unless these specific set of conditions are hit, and then we can close the position, or we can forcefully liquidate the position, and so on. So you can do you can enforce certain conditions with smart contracts that people used to just do. They used to add those terms into these big lot of legal agreements. They still need to do some legal agreements off chain to represent the whole package, but they don't need to rely just on those legal agreements when you can use on-chain infrastructure and architecture. We saw a few years ago, there was a lot of turbulence in the crypto world because people were going out and collateralizing their fund positions off-chain with lots of off-chain agreements. So a lot of times those agreements, it turns out, were being broken. Or years later, it emerged that lots of these agreements just weren't being adhered to. And part of the reason for that, I think, was that there was a lack of transparency in how things were managed. When you have a system that's on chain, you also benefit from a degree of increased transparency
and auditability.
Yeah, you can see like that the collateral is still there, or if it's not there, like where did it go? Like, you can add conditions into the smart contracts that permissioning conditions that the collateral can only be transferred to a certain other smart contract or certain smart contract address under like certain time frames. You can add compliance checks, for instance. There's some cool systems some cool partnerships Euler has with a firm called Keyring, and they effectively allow people to provide information to them in private, and they then take that information and they use zero knowledge proofs to bring it on chain, so that a smart contract can verify that you, Sina, you've met some set of criteria that the smart contract requires without actually having to see all the information that you provided. We don't need to dig in and see the picture of your passport and see see your bank statements and so on. You provide that to a third party that you trust, and then the smart contracts can just come in and verify that those conditions have been met without you risking putting any of that information out into the public domain or anywhere else. You can verify it and then remove it once you've done it. And some of these more private use cases for smart contracts are growing in popularity. And there's a lot of really big institutions looking to take advantage of the infrastructure and the pipes of DeFi, to bring things on chain, to make them more efficient, to make them more transparent, and to bring stronger enforcement rules around how terms are being agreed.
Totally. I've also been recently going down the rabbit hole with trusted execution environments, which are, secure hardware that runs code with certain kind of integrity and confidentiality guarantees. It's kind of like a hardware construct for getting some of the same properties that ZK gives you in a much simpler way. And I feel like, they're being used pretty heavily in the world. Like the new kind of Flashbots decentralized block builder is using TEs in production now. And just hearing you talk about this, there's been some ideas for especially kind of tail end markets, like, e-commerce providers, like Amazon giving loans to small sellers based on their historical revenues, or Stripe extending loans to SaaS companies based on, again, their revenues. And I feel like there could be an interesting design space here around having like a TE that is verifiably, calling this API with the credentials of the company, getting the information, checking that it's signed by the Stripe servers, and then like acting as the oracle for an Euler market. and not revealing any of the information, but also kind of like showing that the entire link has been done correctly. So there could be a really interesting way to connect these previously, separate real world markets with on-chain capital markets.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much cool tech out there being developed right now, and I think all the AI stuff as well, how these positions are being managed, is another really exciting area. We've got something else called we built with in conjunction with a security firm called Forta. That's a firewall around these contracts that can detect when interactions with the smart contracts are malicious or friendly, and reject malicious transactions before anything ever gets executed. Yeah, I think we're just on the cusp of like a massive wave of innovation for lending and borrowing, not just on chain, but it just in general. I think a lot of companies are exploring this now that would really surprise people if they find out that they'd been working on this stuff for years already in the background.
Mm-hmm. It's time to kind of update our priors and revisit some of these questions. So I spent some time before our call reading your PhD thesis about kind of taking a dynamical systems, or I'll let you kind of describe it on natural selection. And I kind of got the sense that these ideas might have some parallels and applicability to what we're talking about today. But it just seems like it seems like a very interesting kind of research direction in its own right. So what are you kind of exploring there?
Yeah, so there's I worked as an evolutionary theorist. So a lot of people, when I say evolution, they think of like the sort of like the man, the sort of like ape developing into a man sort of thing. I think of like biologists working in labs and things, but for the most part, I work purely from first principles as more of a mathematician on trying to abstract the principles of evolution through natural selection and try to encapsulate them in like mathematical framework effectively. So it touched on two areas of maths. There's game theory and then there's dynamical systems. Dynamical systems are really the types of like the branch of maths that explains like how a system changes over time. So explaining where planets move to in a solar system, or how particles move through space. And so in natural selection, we try to predict how populations of biological entities will change through time. How will the composition of the population change through time? What's really interesting about biology and natural systems is that the fate of the entities depends not just on the properties of themselves, but also on the properties of the other entities that they coexist with. And the entities often play strategies. They have behaviors which determine the success, and figuring out who wins and who's which strategy is most likely to dominate is actually very complicated. You might have heard of things like the prisoner's dilemma, or like I think we even mentioned at the start of the call tragedy of the commons. Thinking about what's the kind of optimum strategy to take as an entity if you want to make sure that your descendants survive into future populations. So I was essentially abstracting the principles of natural selection and trying to write this framework, and so that's why my thesis was called the dynamical systems theory of natural selection. Trying to merge branches of game theory with I guess branches of maths that people more commonly associate with physics and maybe chemistry.
How? What does that look like?
So there are key questions in evolutionary theory that people have battled with and tried to answer, struggle to answer, I suppose, for a long time. Which is one of the key ones is, how does natural selection ever favor strategies of cooperation? if we think of natural selection as a process, it's this like ruthless optimizer of the characteristics of biological things, right? So if you run a bit faster, then you survive and you have more offspring. So natural selection likes things that run faster, or bigger, stronger, faster. And when it comes to behaviors where you interact with other individuals, if I choose to cooperate, then what that means biologically is that I'm expending essentially some of my future reproductive success, some of my energy, some of my resources to benefit another. Now, why should I ever do that? That seems like if I can just not do that, then I would essentially save on those resources, but I could potentially exploit and benefit from the cooperation of others, right? Like if we're considering some kind of partnership, why should I not always cheat in that relationship and effectively exploit the cooperators? I take the advantages and the benefits cooperation provides, but not pay its costs. In game theory, these are called like free riders. There are lots of cooperative systems in the world, though. We see cooperation throughout the natural world. All scales of the biological hierarchy, where you can even define cooperation at a molecular level in a certain technical sense, but certainly among animal behaviors, we see lots of cooperation. So how do you explain where that cooperation comes from? It seems like natural selection should ruthlessly punish cooperators in favor of selfish parties. And it turns out that you need to bring together dynamical systems theory and game theory to really explain how cooperation can flourish in a world where at a very local level, cooperation is actually the least favorable strategy. It turns out that over a short time horizon and in very local interactions, it pays to be selfish. But over longer time frames and at scale, with certain types of organization of groups and things, it turns out that cooperation is actually can flourish and become a more profitable strategy than pure selfishness, and that helps explain why the world is more of a cooperative place than you might expect, just from a naive interpretation.
Fascinating.
Of the theory of natural selection.
Yeah, it's like the iterative versus the one-time prisoner's dilemma. In the iterative one, you wanna work, you wanna collaborate because both of your outcomes are better. I was thinking as you started talking that you were gonna take it in the direction of more like kin selection and things like that, where you kind of even if you're individual as an individual, your reproduction goes down, you're benefiting you're helping spread the genes of your like direct relations, and so that's selected for. But it's kind of interesting that genes or mutations that that kind of benefit taking a longer term perspective and playing these iterated games might actually be selected for because those people end up becoming those persons end up becoming more successful over time.
Yeah, so in kin selection theory, the idea ultimately is, would you ever sacrifice yourself for the benefit of another? Sacrifice your entire life. Would you jump into run into a burning building or whatever? And the genes encoding that kind of selflessness, that cooperative behavior, altruistic behavior, how could they spread? Right, it seems like a real dead end. Like if I carry the gene that influences me to run into a burning building to save people, well, it doesn't sound like that's going to survive very long. But if I carry out selfless behaviors and altruistic behaviors towards relatives who also carry copies of the same gene, and that behavior benefits more relatives and helps those genes spread through them more than it would do through just me, then actually natural selection can still favor the spread of selfless, altruistic genes effectively. We see this, with like honeybees effectively, the other pollinating insects, the hymenopteran insects like ants and bees and wasps. Why should a bee ever selflessly sacrifice herself to go and to protect the colony? And the reason that she does that, and it is always the she, it's not he, is because her selfless behavior effectively benefits the colony and all her sisters, all her siblings, and the queen, and all the queen's offspring. And through that selfless behavior, she actually passes on her own genes for selfless behavior through to the survival of the colony to future generations. So that explains a large portion of cooperative behavior in nature, is that we tend to be more cooperative with people through which we share genetic relations. So we're quite cooperative with family members, although not always, right? And that explains a lot of cooperation in the natural world. You typically see favorable behaviors being displayed towards relatives. But there are other things. I mean, you mentioned like the iterative games. Really what's required for cooperation to flourish is that you tend to act more commonly with, you tend to interact more commonly with other cooperators than you do with defectors. If there are sort of structural phenomena in the world that mean that, I'm just more likely to interact with these positive sum interactions, that really helps cooperation flourish, because then you just get more and more positive sum interactions. The cooperators get more and more out of the system to the exclusion of the selfish actors, and therefore cooperation spreads. But even one cooperator, even one non-cooperator or defector or free rider or whatever who can invade a population of cooperators can bring the whole system tumbling down very, very quickly, because that's the best place to be. And if you're an defector in amongst a population that's cooperating with abandon, then you can really benefit, because you pay zero cost and you just get all these benefits. And so the key to allowing cooperation to flourish in an evolutionary sense is to making sure that cooperators interact more with other cooperators and not defectors. Yeah, and there are lots of examples of how natural selection can favor the emergence of such systems, and it gets very, very, very complex. And there's a whole literature around what are called the levels of selection. That the idea that natural selection can act on different types of units. A unit of selection is something that's able to essentially replicate itself, or pass on kind of copies of itself to a future generation. And there are different levels at which that happens in natural selection. The lowest level, the ultimate lowest level at which you get a replicating entity, is the level of the gene itself. And so earlier I mentioned the technical sense in which genes can cooperate, and that's what I meant by that. You can actually get genes which will influence the environment in such a way that benefit other genes. And the lowest level of natural selection turns out to be groups of genes effectively interacting with one another in a sort of chemical lower level sense. But on top of that, you get genes exist within cells exist within bodies exist within groups and other populations. And so there's replication at all sorts of different levels of selection. Cells can replicate to create other cells, and bodies replicate to make other bodies. Sometimes groups can, in some sense, replicate to create a daughter group. That's certainly true of like a colony of honeybees or ants, right? But there's even a very weak sense, I suppose, in which some groups of certain ideologies maybe can replicate and seed groups with similar ideologies. So different levels of selection can interact in different ways as well. I think most people might have heard about the book The Selfish Gene, that was by Richard Dawkins. And the reason he titled the book The Selfish Gene was that he was effectively explaining how selfishness at a genetic level manifests as cooperation at a higher level of selection. So when you're wondering why bodies and organisms would ever interact in a cooperative manner, it's partly explained by pure selfishness at this lower level of selection. So that's what he meant by the selfish gene. He's showing how low level selection at that unit of natural selection can manifest as this cooperative, altruistic, often behaviors at high levels.
What a wondrous thing.
Yeah.
I just love the fact that we can be alive and just nerd out on everything.
Yeah,
It's
it's
endless.
great.
Yeah.
No, I mean, yeah, I really could keep going all day. And there's loads of people wonder, how the applications of all this, my prior research into DeFi, but in many respects there are lots of overlaps. You're constantly in DeFi, you're constructing systems where you have actors or entities, and they exist in the sort of population. They carry out behaviors which are often competitive, like they're rational actors trying to compete a lot of the time, and you want to guide the behavior of the system into a way that means that it's ultimately that that it doesn't fall apart, that it's sort of cohesive and survives in spite of this competition, right? And sometimes turn competition to your favor to make sure that it's actually productive. So there are clever mechanisms you can use where you introduce things like auctions or competitive bidding processes where you have these MEV bots swarming over things, and these pure selfish MEV bots turn out to be actually doing a massive service to the system. In the case of liquidation of loans, for instance, you want to liquidate a distressed loan. Well, if you offer just a tiny little incentive to out there to anybody that comes in and liquidate the loan, you'll find that some random pie from the other side of the world will happily do this and carry out this very important service for you because of their own selfish interest in obtaining a small incentive for doing so. So yeah, there's a lot of the design space in DeFi is massive and has a lot of parallels with how I think natural selection solves problems out there in the real world of biology.
Amazing. Well, I think you have an all hands to run to. So
I do.
maybe we can take this as the point to close. And
Yeah.
I hope we can jam again together before long.
Yeah, let's do it.
Thanks so much. Hey, I have a small ask here. If you've been listening to these conversations and want to support what we're doing here, I would really appreciate if you leave a rating and a review for the podcast. It might seem like a small thing, but it actually makes a big difference to help other people discover the show also. Thank you, and I'll see you again soon.